And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you can join us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that, in episode 88, we're joined by Natalie Grinvalds. Now, Natalie is a behavior change researcher, and she's actually did her dissertation research on something that's very near and dear to the heart of solving the wellness paradox, which is actually co-locating physicians with fitness professionals in the same building. But that's not what this conversation is about. In this conversation, we're going to focus on principles of behavior change, which I think is so timely given the fact that it's January and everyone has came back into fitness clubs and is looking to get results quick. And in this conversation, we'll unpack some theories of behavior change and some ways to think about facilitating behavior change in our clients. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 88. Please enjoy this conversation with Natalie Grinvalds. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Natalie Grinvalds. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm super excited for this conversation. I've followed your content on LinkedIn for a while, and you have a knowledge of behavior change, which is one of my favorite topics to have on here. And it's a very topical conversation, given that we're in January and all the things that people need to think about with behavior change. But before we launch into that, why don't you just give us a little bit more of an idea of your background?
Started my undergrad degree at Indiana University, applied health sciences, public health and nutrition. Did an internship in cardiac rehab that was kind of sparked my interest in the use of physical activity to help change people's health outcomes. And then worked a little bit for our public health department, and eventually decided I need to go back and do my master's. I was interested in behavior change, so did a master in public health and behavior, social, and community health, again at Indiana University. And the last part of that degree, we had to do a placement anywhere in the world. I had some connections in the UK, and I was really interested in the way that the United Kingdom addresses health inequalities versus the US and kind of the context of the national healthcare system here. So did a placement with a community development trust in a very deprived area of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. And since then, stayed in the UK, worked a couple of different jobs. Found my way into a workplace wellness position at Sheffield Hallam University. And that's when I really kind of got into the behavior change on a practical level. And then found out about a PhD in physical activity and recently completed that, and now working in behavior change in the south of England in Exeter. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the completing of the PhD. That's a big deal.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really a interesting journey. Learned a lot about the healthcare system in the UK, the use of physical activity to promote health outcomes. And one thing I did forget to mention was during this time, kind of developed different physical activity fitness qualifications. Became a personal trainer and became really interested in applying behavior science to my fitness instruction as well.
Awesome. And yeah, that's part of where our discussion is going to end up going here. Man, I got to tell you, like a whole separate podcast is the difference between physical activity interventions in America's healthcare system versus the more socialized system over there. I am not going to go down that rabbit hole, but that is a fascinating conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's something that I think could definitely take up a whole another conversation. And it was very, very challenging to learn about the NHS, National Healthcare System in the UK at the same time as doing a PhD.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'm going to stop myself from going there because my brain is wanting to formulate questions. So you said it a second ago. You are doing fitness but you're also studying behavior change on this, very, academic level. So you're blending the two, which I find amazingly cool, is one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on as a guest. So let's frame this up with this time of year first, because you're going to have fitness professionals listening to this that are like, it's New Year's resolution time and clients want results now. What should fitness professionals be thinking about with these clients that are coming through the door wanting to lose 40 pounds before the end of February?
Yeah, that's a big one. Some people are New Year's resolution setters, me not so much, but I think, first of all, we need to meet the client where they're at, and, remember that, we don't want to shame them for having these goals and these ideas about the way they want to change behavior. But I think trying to scale it back, and, remind them what is actually achievable. And also, I think not to impose our goals or the way we think they should change their behavior onto them. For instance, maybe we think they need to be doing strength training 3 times a week and, following a certain plan, but it's got to work around their context of their life and their lifestyle behavior and what they are motivated by. But I think it's important to remind them, you want to develop a habit that's sustainable long-term, and kind of going from doing nothing to, exercising every day isn't necessarily sustainable. But, having a conversation, meeting them where they're at. And I think crucially, before talking about anything fitness related, it's really important to develop that trust, and that rapport, and just have a conversation with them and get to know them, a bit about their background and their lifestyle before you dive into what goals can we set.
I'm gonna put a pin in that aspect on like the developing the trust and rapport, and I want to come back to that. But I do want to ask you a question, which I always find so challenging, is that the approach that you said is somewhat countercultural, at least to the mass media that surrounds New Year's resolutions. How do you suggest that a fitness professional handles that when the client is just getting bombarded by, hey, you can lose 40 pounds in 40 days and all these kind of outrageous goals? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think I try to remind them that, this is a multi-billion-pound dollar industry that is wanting to prey on their insecurities and this time of year and how they're feeling about themselves after the holidays. And my kind of other angle would be, look, this is old school style of, setting really strict, having really strict regimes, setting really strict New Year's resolutions. But the research shows that shaming and trying to bully yourself into changing behavior is not effective long term. And I try to remind them that this is the evidence, but it doesn't always work. But I think it's trying to remind them that, look, you want to develop sustainable habits. Otherwise, you're going to have a revolving door, or you're just going to be stuck in a vicious cycle of not being able to change your behavior. I really try to remind them that, look, in the long run, we want to maintain this behavior for life.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said there. It is that high dollar industry that really drives a lot of this. I was also very impressed how you've adapted to the American and the British monetary systems. You said dollar pound without like skipping a beat. So that was very impressive. But you're right, there's a lot of money that is behind it, and which that again, that is a separate conversation. So
yes, definitely.
So let's start to think of this from, first a perspective of some of the mistakes that either you've made in the past that you've learned from, or you've seen other trainers make around trying to facilitate behavior change. Because I think we are all very well-intentioned, like we want a positive long-term outcome.
Yes.
But sometimes that works against us. So talk about some of the mistakes that you've seen. And then after that, we can get into, okay, what are some of the best practices here to follow?
Okay. I think some of the mistakes I've seen, again, I touched on this earlier, are kind of trying to impose our goals or what we think the client needs to be doing onto them. Yes, we have knowledge, we have expertise, but I think it's important to find out what they're most motivated by, what's realistic in the context of their life, what barriers and kind of issues they're facing. Another mistake, I think, is to just go in with all of the knowledge that we know straight away. I think I see this in in myself when I first started doing, for example, the workplace wellness counseling. I come straight out of my master's. You feel like you have all of this knowledge. You've spent loads of time, investment into your degree, and you just want to share all this knowledge with your client. But I think it's important to hold back, find out. Now I'm pulling from some principles of motivational interviewing, but kind of find out what they know. How can you build upon that before you just go into sharing all of your knowledge? Because I think you can write the best well-intentioned plan for your client, but people don't care how much you know until they really know that you care about them. And I know that might sound a bit cheesy, but it's a truth. So I think making sure you develop that rapport first, finding a bit about them before you just go in with, planning some elaborate plan that maybe it's not realistic for their lives.
Yeah, that's great. But I think that's all too common, right? Like somebody comes in and they say, hey, I want to get fit or I want to lose weight. And they're like, great, I got the plan, let's go. Right. I mean, that seems to be the mentality.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
And I think, people think, oh, I need to get this elaborate plan so that I can start and go through my New Year's resolutions and achieve them quickly. But I think we've got to remind them that, look, we have an approach. We'll get there over the next 12 weeks or whatever. But to get them to buy into that, you need to develop that trust first, if that makes sense.
It doesn't. And I think that's such a critical thing. I mean, trust is the foundation of every relationship. It doesn't matter if it's, your client relationship, your romantic relationship, your relationship with your pet, like trust is everything. So talk to our audience a little bit about how you suggest to approach the trust building process, because it does take some time. And I think unpacking that a little bit could be helpful.
Yeah, I think, not everybody has, maybe loads of time, but pulling from some principles of motivational interviewing in terms of, how kind of to develop trust. I'm thinking of kind of the underlying spirit of motivational interviewing, which I was recently doing some lecturing on at Sheffield Hallam, is firstly having compassion for the client's situation. Maybe they've been off sick from COVID for several months, and they're just getting back into physical activity, or maybe they're kind of fearful of the weight room, or doing strength training, and maybe you're really confident in strength training, but we've got to kind of get on their level to understand where they're coming from. So being compassionate towards a client's situation, kind of respecting their autonomy and their decision, helping them to take ownership of the goals that they want to set as well. And then working together, so collaborating on, what's important to you, how does my expertise fit with this, and kind of, again, evocation, or kind of drawing out the goals or their motivation. So for instance, maybe a client has been referred to you from a GP to lower their cholesterol, and you see, okay, they need to do a certain amount of aerobic activity per week, and I'll help get their cholesterol number down. But maybe that doesn't really matter to that person. Maybe they're a mom that just wants to be able to run after their kids on the playground and keep up with their kids and be there for them long term. I think tapping into that. Okay, this is the target. This is that goal that we want to achieve, but how can I relate that back to my client in a way that matters to them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it sounds like you're suggesting, which might seem foreign to some people, a process that is a lot more about listening and asking than it is about telling.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And I think, again, going back to maybe some mistakes I made early on, and I think mistakes that are all too common in maybe fitness and healthcare in general, is the practitioner or the exercise referral or exercise professional doing most of the talking. And I think in the beginning, letting that client do most of the talking, because you're getting really valuable information about things that matter to them and what's crucial to developing a plan to help them change behavior from listening.
Yeah, and it's tough. And I think back to early in my career, and you kind of alluded to this a moment ago, is that, you get all this knowledge when you come out of school and
enthusiasm.
You want to tell it to everyone. And I think in part, you're trying to prove to yourself that you know it by saying it. And so it's very counterintuitive, I feel like, to want to not play the expert in the relationship.
Yes, it feels very wrong. And I think just because recently I was teaching some motivational interviewing to public health nutrition students in Sheffield. And when I first tell them, I just want you to hold back, listen to your client, and then repeat back what you've heard and help them with the plan going forward. And it feels very counterintuitive. But then once they see that it's effective, and actually the client will come up with their own resolution from listening, from using those skills, rather than you telling them what you think they need to do and potentially wasting time on things that wouldn't work for them anyway. But it's a skill, it takes time. And I understand, not everyone has time, but I think the more of those principles that you can learn of not just motivational interviewing, but effective listening and communication can be really helpful in achieving that behavior change long term.
Yeah, absolutely. It is hard to not talk. Like it's hard to. So
I know.
Yeah, you mentioned motivational interviewing a couple times, and so I think it's important we go down this path. We've talked about it on the podcast here or there, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about what motivational interviewing is and maybe some of its principles, because I think it provides a really good framework for what you're talking about here.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of pulls together different aspects of counseling that are not really unique, but the way it's pulled together and the underlying spirit of motivational interviewing is kind of what makes it what it is. So it could be described as a counseling style. It was developed initially to help people stop with tobacco cessation, stop smoking, and has since been reported to be effective for changing a lot of different addictive behaviors, but also things like overeating, exercise, physical activity, different types of interventions. So I described kind of the underlying spirit or ethos of motivational interviewing, which is really centered around collaboration, having compassion for your client's situation, drawing out or eliciting those goals from the client rather than kind of imposing them onto them, and then motivation, autonomy. So developing that client's autonomy. So I think that's where it kind of maybe sits, and some research in my PhD that I reported on sits a bit counterintuitive with the personal training industry, where we kind of want someone to keep coming back to us, but developing that autonomy in them is really crucial with motivational interviewing. And then there's kind of some techniques or skills which are used. And again, these are not unique. These are used in other types of counseling, but the way they're pulled together is what makes it MI. So there's open-ended questions. These are described often as the OARS skills, an acronym, OARS, open-ended questions. So really asking more open-ended questions. Would you tell me a little bit about your physical activity habits? Would you tell me a little bit about what you like to do, to be physically active? Affirmations, so kind of affirming where they've done something good. So maybe a client says to you, I've tried loads of fitness classes. Nothing really interests me. I can't stick to anything long-term. It's not praising, but it's kind of affirming what they're already doing that's good. And I might say, look, you're the type that's going to try lots of different things. That's a really great thing. You've been willing to try lots of different activities. Reflections, so reflecting back what you've heard. People really like to feel like they've been heard. And the more accurate those reflections can be, the more effective they can become. So maybe a client says to you, I really, would like to feel stronger in myself and just feel like I can get through the day without feeling exhausted. And it just simple reflection or complex reflection. I can just reflect back to them. You'd like to feel stronger in your everyday life. You'd like to feel like you can get through the day feeling, resilient and strong. And then summarizing. So summarizing everything you've discussed. And so that's kind of the motivational interviewing in a nutshell, but it serves to kind of draw out that motivation from within them. And it has shown to be effective in lots of different settings to change behavior long term.
Yeah, that was a great summary of
Sorry, that was a lot, yeah.
Motivational interviewing there. And I love the framework. I love the OARS skills, because I feel like they're actually things that you can work on as a professional to get better at. And this sounds like something you teach. How do you recommend people go about actually learning these skills? I mean, I know part of it is just, hey, you got to do it, but is there a framework that you think about when you tell people to implement the skills?
Well, there's a motivational interviewing network of trainers, which is kind of the credentialing body for motivational interviewing if you want to go down the official route. And I know they've got loads of different trainings all around the world. But there's also texts that you can read or, different articles and sources on that website as well. I think practicing is really crucial. We did it as part of our training for the Sheffield Hallam University Wellness program. We did it over a week, role playing in group settings or in pairs after we kind of learned the skills. And I think that was really, really crucial. You've got to really try to practice it in order to become good at it. And then eventually you can record your sessions and code your sessions for how many times you're using these different skills. And that's where it was really illuminating the first time I had a session recorded and realized just how many closed questions you're asking, because that feels natural, you know. So
I'd like to take a quick break from today's episode to tell you a little something about one of our sponsors. As all of you are well aware, addressing the wellness paradox is a lifelong passion project for me. And when you're going to go on a long journey, it's difficult to go it alone. You need to find like-minded individuals that are willing to go on that crusade with you. And that's exactly what I found at the MRF Institute. The team over at the MRF Institute creates educational content for fitness and wellness professionals who are serious about becoming a part of our healthcare continuum. Getting on the healthcare continuum is all about leveling up our skills to be looked at as that valued resource provider. The wellness paradox is certainly an avenue for you to do that, but we need many different levers to pull if we're going to get there. And the MRF Institute is definitely one of those levers. You can go to their website, mrfinstitute.org, to find all kinds of great, informative, free informational content. And if you choose to engage with any of their paid content, they've created a coupon code specifically for Wellness Paradox listeners. You can enter in WP 2022, that's WP, and then the number 2022 to the website at checkout to receive a 15% discount on your purchase. I highly recommend you go check out mrfinstitute.org. Now back to today's episode. Yeah, absolutely. And I have some experience with doing motivational interviewing, and it's hard. It's not something you can just go, oh, get it, or skills, got it, I can go do that. It takes reps.
Yeah, it takes energy. You've got to really actively, listen and pay attention. And I understand, maybe a personal trainer that doesn't feel relevant to them in the context of a busy gym where, there's loads going on. I don't have a whole hour, but I think you can still use these skills and, you can still, use some of these skills where it's necessary. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So I'm so interested to get your thoughts on listening, because we've talked about listening for a while here, and listening, it's not one of the OR skills per se, but it kind of undergirds all of the OR skills. How do you think about listening as a coach, or how do you teach the concept of listening to people? Because it's an active thing. It's not a passive thing.
Yes. Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think, sitting there with the client, being fully present, paying, attention to what they're saying. I'm trying to explain this without saying listening. Not looking, as a personal trainer, not looking at your phone, not looking around the room, not looking at your notes. Paying attention to the body language and the way that someone's saying things, because that can help you to know when you should ask another question. So for instance, I really hate strength training. You might say, well, what is it about, strength training that you really don't think you like? So I guess, paying attention to them, looking at their body language, and asking questions where appropriate.
Yeah, with the presence thing. I mean, that's a challenge just in general in society, right? Like,
yes,
tend to be that focused just because of all the stuff.
Yes, yeah, it's getting harder and harder as well. And I think it's important not to lose that human element of all of this as things become more digitalized. And just today I did a virtual indoor cycling class, and 3 other people showed up for that class. But it was really about the conversations that I had with those 3 before and after the class that really made it a worthwhile experience. Sorry to get off topic, but I think we mustn't lose that human element in all of this.
I don't actually think it's off topic at all. I think it's dead on, because look, AI and all of the technology is coming, if it's not already here, but it
Yes.
can't replace a one-on-one, human
Yes.
interaction like
Yes.
we're having. It
Yes.
just can't.
Yes. Yeah. And I think so much about, the fitness industry is that human element, and so much about personal training. Yes, it's important to have that knowledge. It's really great, but most of us aren't going to work with, athletes or celebrities, and oftentimes people just want to be heard, and they want to be understood, and they want someone that's going to listen to them, and help kind of draw out what's important to them in order to develop them a plan to help them be physically active. And yeah.
I had a client, what you said there caused me to flash back to my early 20s with a client I was training once. And I asked her why she kept training with me, because we reached like all of her fitness goals and she was in great shape. Everything was great. And she said, well, because my husband works 80 hours a week. I've got 4 kids at home. Nobody listens to me. And I just want someone who's going to listen to me for 3 hours a week.
Yes. Yeah. That's amazing. What was your response?
Said, I'll listen. Yeah. So, but it was just, but I think the interesting thing is it hit me that it wasn't all about just me giving knowledge and me writing a plan. It was just like showing up for what this person needed those 3 days a week, was showing up in a way that was just there to listen.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that is really huge. And just thinking about my fitness teaching, I teach a lot of indoor cycling. I think a lot of people just come because they like to be around other people. They like kind of that community element. It's almost like, not as much pressure as being part of a sports team, but there's that environment that we've all gone through this together. And I think that's really, important element not to forget about.
You said something which I definitely think is worth touching on, because of the nature of the personal training industry. Like, this is like an on the workout floor, like you're doing stuff, you're exercising. And I've always struggled to have really good behavior change conversations with somebody for their 30 seconds in between sets of squats and med ball slams. Do you suggest that when possible, fitness professionals carve out some actual sit down coaching time with their clients?
Yes, I think that's really key. I mean, I know that not everybody has that luxury, but I think, there's a time and a place for using behavior change techniques, and there's a time and a place for maybe having a chat or just encouraging someone to keep going, maybe on their plank that they're doing or whatever. But I think it's important to carve out that time separately if you can. And I think the investment from maybe taking some time from your session could be worth it long term by taking that little bit of extra time to set some goals, action plan, or do a bit of motivational interviewing.
Yeah, and that's very helpful, and I agree, because you can't have a great conversation with somebody when they're completely out of breath.
Yeah, you want to talk about what? They're sweating and breathing heavy. Yeah.
So let's, as you kind of bring this to a close, I'd like this to get pretty tactical for our listeners. So, when you bring on a client that you're going to work with, or maybe you're advising somebody about how to bring on a client, like, how does that process, normally go? How do you do your intake? Like, how do you set the goals? Like, just kind of high level, walk us through like how you actually do the thing you do with an individual.
Okay. Could I talk about some examples from my workplace wellness?
It's perfect.
Okay. So just to provide a bit of context, in the work that I did with Sheffield Hallam's workplace wellness program, we had a separate office with where we would conduct about 30 minutes of physiological tests, so things like height, weight, body mass index, grip strength, a submaximal seated bike test to assess their aerobic capacity, things like lung function. And then we would sit down with them after that kind of first half an hour or so, and feedback the results that we put into this software program that we use, and feedback the results to them using motivational interviewing. In the beginning of the session, the client would fill out a health history form where we would just review that and then ask a bit about their physical activity levels, other things going on in their life, and kind of then we would feedback the results to them using motivational interviewing. So for instance, maybe I'm giving them the report from their cholesterol reading, and I might say, on a bar chart, color-coded bar chart, this is where your cholesterol sits. what do you know about cholesterol? Would you mind telling me a little bit about what you know? And they might say, I think it's the fats in your bloods. And I said, yep, that's right. Do you mind if I tell you a little bit more? So with motivational interviewing, always asking for permission before we
Mhm.
offload that information. And that's where I struggled in the beginning.
Mm.
So then I might say, yeah, so this is, you're partially right. I'll tell you a little bit more about your cholesterol. And this is where yours sits on that scale. Oh, that they might say, oh, that doesn't look too good. And I say, well, it is on the higher side. And then we kind of talk about, what can we do to bring that down? And then kind of set some goals. So we would go through this for each different element of the physiological tests. And then at the end, we'd summarize everything. So we've talked about these different physiological tests that we've done today. Your cholesterol was a bit elevated. Your aerobic capacity could be a little bit improved. What would you like to set goals on? What would you like to focus on? What is one manageable, achievable thing you could do when you walk out that door today? And some people don't want to set goals. They would just come for an annual review of their health. But other people would. And we kind of put 3 achievable, manageable goals that they could do on a little card so it's in front of them every day. But one thing when I set goals with people is to make them manageable and achievable, kind of using those SMART goals principles, if you've heard of those. But I think really making it one manageable, achievable challenge that they can do when they walk out that door today, because if they achieve that, it's going to build upon their self-efficacy or their belief in themselves, that is going to want to motivate them to set further goals.
That's great. And I want to point out a couple things in the process that you did there, which I feel are very different from what's traditionally done. Like, you got the cholesterol measure back and you didn't say, hey, your cholesterol is too high, you need to lower it.
Yes.
You actually entered that conversation with curiosity to see where they were at and if they were even interested in hearing more about it.
Yeah, because we know that if people aren't, if it's not something that's important to them, people aren't going to want to change behavior. If they don't want to change behavior, they're not going to. But we can help them to understand and draw out what they know and find out how important it is to them, how ready they are to change, how confident they are in their belief in doing so.
Yeah. And to that same end, when you got to the conclusion of the discussion, you didn't say, hey, you need to improve this, and this. You asked them what they wanted to work on.
Yeah. I mean, we might kind of by the end of that session, get to the fact that, okay, I've told them that physical activity is one thing that can help to decrease your cholesterol, and then we could set some goals. But I always want to find out, what do they know first? What's important to them before I just, tell them what I know.
Yeah, I've always said that the process you follow is, I mean, it's the process that I evolved to follow in my career. And I think a lot of evidence-based professionals do, but it's a process of, you end up going slow to go fast. I feel like most people want to just tell them what to do and get going, and then you stall. But by doing the process that you're talking about, it's a little bit slower in the beginning, but it builds momentum.
Yeah, I almost think of it as like an upfront investment for longer term behavior change, taking time to get to know someone, finding out what they know, finding out what goals matter to them. Because very well said.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate the actual breakdown of the process, because I think, like, tactically, that's something that people could do. Maybe not everyone who's listening is going to do a cholesterol biometric, but we can all run tests and then have a collaborative conversation around what those mean from an outcome perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Natalie, this has been great. I can keep going down the behavior change conversation for hours and hours and hours, because I think it's such an important thing. I always say, you could write the most perfect exercise program in the world, but if no one's willing to adhere to it, it's not going to help them. So this is such a critical message for our audience to be hearing, particularly this time of year. Where can people go if they want to find out more about the stuff that you're doing? Yeah,
you can find me on LinkedIn. Another thing, I can provide a link to my thesis, which we didn't really get to talk about today, which is kind of around what happens when you put together leisure centers with NHS clinics. How does that work to promote physical activity? So I can put a link to that. And then also a bit more about the centers, those co-located health and leisure centers in Sheffield that I've studied, and
Awesome. So we will link up to that on the show notes page. But before I let you go, I want to end the podcast with the question that I always end the podcast on. Given your role in kind of a nationalized health system and in fitness, I'm really curious to get your perspective. You might be the first guest I've asked this to that is not in the United States healthcare system. So this will be an interesting answer. I consider the wellness paradox to be the gap that exists between fitness professionals and the medical community. Based on your global experience now, what's one piece of advice you can give to professionals to close off that gap?
Exercise professionals or healthcare professionals?
Exercise professionals.
I think that's a really challenging one. I think, again, a lot of this comes back to taking time to getting to know each other's roles. And I feel like because I interviewed healthcare professionals in my PhD, I think they also need to take time to get to know what the exercise professional's role, their knowledge, their capability, their experience. But I think it's really about getting to know each other's roles and taking time to develop that trust and realizing that, you know, we both are here for the same purpose. We both want to help improve the clients' lives. And I think healthcare professionals need to realize that exercise professionals have the luxury perhaps of more time, especially in the context of the UK with that person, for instance. So we need to be on the same team. So yeah, taking time to develop that trust. But a lot of that does come into the organizational and, you know, challenges of the healthcare system. Yeah.
It all comes back to trust.
Yeah.
Grinvalds, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Natalie as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares really do make a difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 88. Please be on the lookout for next week's episode when it drops on Wednesday. And don't forget to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next week, please be well.